I've been interested as a cancer epidemiologist in cancer prevention in all its guises for many years, and have published on and off around the topic of breast and prostate cancer screening for some years now, and I followed with interest some of the more recent developments around the potential for blood-based biomarkers as screening tests, which has extended into multimodal blood-based tests, by which I mean detecting lots of different types of cancer with a single test. And so I was just going to give my view on where we are with those, and sort of contrasting a little bit the considerable hype that's been around them, and sort of trying to assess to what extent that hype is realistic and actually what it isn't. So I noticed as people were joining, there's quite a lot of what I would think of as reasonably expert people here. So apologies in advance if my talk's a little bit simplistic. I wasn't sure exactly what the audience was going to be, and I was trying to keep it at a level that would kind of keep everybody on board. But you can ask me the more complex questions at the end if you were to have any. Okay, so my slides don't want to move on. Let me use my mouse. So I think it's worth just thinking about prevention of cancer in general. If you go back to the 1970s and then 80s, primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, after we understood mainly about high blood pressure and the role of cholesterol in cardiovascular disease, and primary prevention was very successful, and people hoped that similar approaches might work for cancer. There have been quite a few large-scale randomized controlled trials of chemopreventive agents, which I would say have basically been disappointing. For example, aspirin for colorectal cancer, COX-2 inhibitors for colorectal cancer, tamoxifen for breast cancer. Other drugs like anastrozole for breast cancer have some promise, but generally they've not become widespread, apart from a small number of individuals who might be at particularly high risk, for where the kind of risk-benefit equation is perhaps more favorable. But of course, the alternative to primary prevention is secondary prevention or earlier detection, screening. And in cancer, it's very easy to trot out the kind of truism that early stage cancers do better, therefore early detection must be in itself better. And the basis for that statement is shown in this figure here, which are data from the UK. This is all cancers, staged 1, 2, 3, and 4, where stage 4 disease is cancer that is metastatic at diagnosis. In other words, it's spread to distant organs, and stage 1, 2, and 3 are often described as early cancer, but in fact, you know, stage 3 disease has got quite widespread local spread and so on. And the point being that the lower the stage, the better the relative survival. So relative survival is the sort of percentage survival compared to somebody without cancer. So somebody with a stage 1 cancer on average, and a woman, has an almost 100% survival, the same as a woman without cancer. Whereas somebody with metastatic cancer at diagnosis does considerably worse, with a relative survival around about 10%. So diagnose it at an early stage, much better outcomes. And I'll explain why that's not necessarily true in a moment. So what's been the recent progress? So I'll come on to the hype in a minute, but lots of new technologies have been showing some promise as blood tests for cancer. So I'll point out here that blood-based biomarkers for cancer are not new. They've been around for a very long time. CA125 and PSA, which are proteins that can be detected in the blood, have of course led the way. CA125 as a possible biomarker for epithelial ovarian cancer, PSA, prostate-specific antigen, as a biomarker for prostate cancer. However, large-scale randomized trials of both of these biomarkers have shown some of the many problems with screening that belie the, well, let's detect it early, it's bound to do much better. Other biomarkers have come and gone without really getting to the stage of large-scale trials. I think 20, 25 years ago, people thought that sort of proteomics, looking at all the proteins that we can measure in the bloodstream, would identify other protein biomarkers, but that's failed to deliver. And really what's changed in the last 10 years is that people have realized that in the blood, we can detect not just proteins, but we can also detect free DNA, i.e. DNA that's not in cells, and free DNA from cancer cells differs from DNA from normal cells. And we can also detect cancer cells themselves that might be circulating in the bloodstream. And these are thought to have great promise and of what have risen to a lot of the hype. So I'm going to say a little bit about ctDNA here. So this is a simple figure. This bunch of cartoon cells over here represents the cancer, and that tumor, that cancer, will have a blood supply. They need a blood supply to grow. And tumor cells, like other cells in the body, grow and then they die or apoptose. And when those cells die and break down, some of the DNA will be released into the blood. And so that's represented by this sort of pale blue turquoisey colored DNA, which I've represented here. And there's also normal DNA and free DNA in the blood. But when you take the blood, you can assay this DNA. And because the genetic material of cancer cells differs from the genetic material of normal cells, you can detect those differences and say that you can detect the presence of a cancer somewhere in the body. So often the changes are specific to where the cancers come from. So you might be able to say this change suggests there's a cancer of the breast or a cancer of the pancreas or so on. But sometimes they're non-specific and it doesn't help. And so because DNA is released by lots of different cancers, a single blood test has the potential to identify cancer from any site in the body. And that, of course, is fundamentally different from sort of the standard paradigm of screening screening that is in widespread use, such as X-ray mammography for breast cancer, sigmoidoscopy, flexible sigmoidoscopy, or colonoscopy for colorectal cancer, cervical smears, and so on. And as I said, because different patterns of genetic abnormalities occur in different cancers, it does have the potential to be able to identify the cancer site. So what's the hype? So when you read the press releases relating to either the publications or when companies start to market these tests, you know, these dramatic words like breakthrough, revolutionary, great hope, transformation are widely used. And I think most of these words are seriously overused, and we should be being much more cautious about the potential. Of course, companies like to use these words because they're interested in selling tests and making money. That is their primary goal. Saving lives is not their primary goal. So I'll say a little bit about the Grail test. I didn't realize that you talked about this before. So the Grail test is a one version of a multi-cancer early detection blood test that claims to be able to detect 50 cancers. And just over 2 years ago now, they announced a clinical trial in partnership with the NHS. So there was a lot of debate at the time because it was very unclear what the protocol for that trial was. and it was not easily available for public scrutiny, but the published plan was that around 150,000 individuals were going to be recruited into what has turned out to be a randomized trial. And so if you read some of these press releases, the hype comes through, and they say they're making it available to patients. Well, that kind of hides the fact that this is a clinical trial rather than routine patients. And at the time of this, the chair of NHS England, I think this quote is really quite misleading. So it focuses on the fact that people are diagnosed often with late-stage disease. And then it says that this collaboration offers the chance for a wide range of cancers to be diagnosed much earlier and could fundamentally change the outlook for people with cancer. I mean, that to me implies that they know that the Grail test is going to be effective at improving the stage at which cancers are diagnosed, and that at that stage had yet to be proven, and has still not been proven, I might add. So that sort of statement, I think, is part of the hype. Slides don't want to move again. Matt Hancock, very prone to hype when he was health secretary over all sorts of things. But he said, exciting and groundbreaking new test will give us another tool to give more people the best chance of survival. Well, again, in the absence of clinical trial data to demonstrate that, that is really putting the cart before the horse. And this is more about the government trying to promote themselves than about any real evaluation of any reasonable evidence. So this is all, I would say, part of the hype. So here's a web page with the news from the NHS, where the word revolutionary is used, and they are piloting the test instead of stating that they are doing a controlled trial. They are saying they are piloting the test. So I was mostly focusing on Grail, but I wanted to add there are other tests apart from Grail out there, and this is one that kind of received a bit of publicity in the last week when the Daily Telegraph had an article from the health editor Laura Donnelly with this headline where she tried to, again, this word, revolutionary new health MOT that can spot most cancers years before symptoms emerge. There is, as I'm going to show you, almost no evidence that that is true for this particular test. So this is a test called TrueCheck, which is a circulating cancer cell detection test. This test is offered by a company called the Cancer Screening Trust, which sounds lovely and benign, but is in fact a commercial company that is charging a whopping £1,250 for this as yet unproven screening test. They do the test and then pass the costs on to the NHS afterwards, which I think is an absolute disgrace. And on their website, they say the test has a 92.1, very precise, sensitivity to detect cancers across all stages and types. There is absolutely no published evidence that this test has a 90% sensitivity in stage 1 cancers, for example. So that's a little bit of the hype. What do we really want to know about an early detection test? Well, so for a test to be useful, first, by definition, it should be able to detect a cancer before symptoms develop. And before claiming that a test is going to be fantastic, you need to demonstrate that. And not only that, it should be able to detect the cancer when it is small enough to be cured. And that means detecting the cancer before it has spread. And micrometastases occur often many years before spread is detected. So, of course, by definition, it needs to be able to detect an early stage cancer, and ideally, it can differentiate cancer from other diseases. And so if you have a screening test and you apply it in a screening program, what should that achieve? Well, first and foremost, it should reduce mortality. So, of course, we don't expect a cancer screening test to reduce mortality from coronary heart disease, but and we'll come on to that in a minute, but it should reduce mortality by reducing mortality rates for the cancer that is being screened for. And as part of the detecting cancer earlier, an effective screening test should mean that the incidence of advanced cancers in the population is reduced. And that's often thought of as stage shift, but stage shift is sometimes also used to mean something quite different that may or may not be useful, as I'll show you shortly. So just some of the sort of truisms around screening, that just because you detect something early doesn't mean to say that it's a good thing. And lead time bias and length time bias are major problems with any kind of cancer or any other screening for that matter. Just to explain what lead time bias is, if we imagine that this red line here is a timeline for an individual, and at some point in time a cancer develops. Initially it's very, very small on cell that doubles and doubles and doubles and starts growing, and then some point in that individual, provided they survive long enough, the cancer will be big enough to cause symptoms and lead to a diagnosis. And if the cancer is not cured, the individual may die from that cancer sometime later. So lead time bias. So cancer develops at the same time, but now imagine we have a screening program, and before symptoms develop, we do a screening test and we detect the cancer. Now, it's entirely plausible that that screening makes no difference at all to the long-term outcome of the cancer, and the individual in this sort of counterfactual would die at the same point in time. But because we measure survival from the time of diagnosis to the time of death, the screen-detected cancer has these added years, so that apparently they do better. But these are just, they're not real added years, they're just an effect of diagnosing it earlier. And that's what lead time bias is. And we know lead time bias is a problem with early detection. So this graph again, with it showing that patients with early stage disease do better, some of that difference, and I'm not saying all of it, some of that difference is lead time bias, because these cancers will take some time and will, if left alone, would become these ones, and then they would become these ones over time. And so what we need to know is to what extent diagnosing early has a real improvement in survival and how much of it is lead time bias. And the other major problem with screening is length time bias and overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And that's the tendency of screening tests to preferentially diagnose slower growing, less aggressive tumors. And so overdiagnosis is simply where we diagnose a cancer that under the counterfactual would not have been diagnosed in the person's lifetime. And so lots of people die from other causes, have cancer at the time of death that hasn't been diagnosed. And this was recognized, this has been recognized for very many years. When I was a medical student, sort of back in the dark ages, you know, I was taught that more men die with prostate cancer than of prostate cancer, meaning that if you look at post-mortem of men elderly men who've died from all sorts of causes, you'll be able to find prostate cancer in their prostates that hadn't been diagnosed in their lifetime. Overdiagnosis by itself is not necessarily a problem, but the real problem is if you diagnose it, it is often then treated. And giving somebody treatment that they don't need because it never would have been diagnosed, or treatment that they don't need because even if it had been diagnosed, they were going to die from something else, is over-treatment. And because treatment for cancer can be quite many side effects, then over-treatment can be a major problem. And so that overdiagnosis occurs in this situation where somebody has a cancer, but they never develop symptoms and they would have died from something else. But under screening, the cancer is detected and they get unnecessary treatment. And of course, they have many years thinking of themselves as a cancer survivor and potentially worrying about having had cancer and worrying about it recurring and so on and so forth. So large-scale randomized controlled trials of breast cancer screening with mammograms and prostate cancer screening with a blood PSA test, and even trials of ovarian cancer screening have shown overdiagnosis is a real problem. And in the case of breast cancer, overdiagnosis results in overtreatment, and that treatment can include radiotherapy, which is potentially serious, because radiotherapy has side effects. It increases a woman's chance of dying from heart disease, for example. So if you give somebody radiotherapy that they didn't need, you're not just not harming them, you're actively harming them by increasing their risk of dying from heart disease. And the problems of overdiagnosis and overtreatment of prostate cancer are well rehearsed, particularly when surgery is used as the primary treatment because of long-term impotence and incontinence, for example. So I should also mention false positives, the particular issue with the multimodal tests, that tests can be positive even if you haven't got cancer, and that's been well established with things like mammograms, where many breast lumps that are detected by mammograms turn out to be benign. CA125 that is used for ovarian cancer, or might be used for ovarian cancer screening, has many causes of an increase where ovarian cancer is not present. And of course, if you have an abnormal screening test, the individual needs to be investigated, and those investigations can be quite invasive, but ultimately were unnecessary because the individual turns out not to have cancer. Finally, I want to just say something about just demonstrating stage shift is not necessarily useful when it is defined as the proportion of cancers that are early stage. And the key thing here is proportion has a numerator and a denominator, and you can change the proportion by changing either the numerator or the denominator or both. So stage shift may not be due to what you're really interested in, as I'll illustrate in a moment. If there's overdiagnosis, the total number of cancers increases and the total number of early cancers may increase, but there may be no concomitant reduction of late stage disease. And I'll illustrate it with this simple pictogram. So let's say we have a whole load of cancers here represented by the individuals with early stage cancer are the blue, and individuals with late stage cancer are the green. And so here we have 50-50 early stage and late stage. And then we introduce a screening test, and now all those cancers, the number of early stages increases and the number of late stage decreases. And now it's a 60-40 split. And that would be useful stage shift because we are improving the stage at diagnosis. But because of overdiagnosis, what we might see is a 50-50 shift. So a pattern like this, where the total number of cancer increases And all of that increase is overdiagnosed early disease, but the number of late stage disease doesn't change. So now we get an apparent stage shift from 50-50 to 68-32, but actually there's been no reduction in late stage cancers, and that screening test with a performance like that probably would not be beneficial. So I want to also comment on the fact that many screening trials demonstrate reduced mortality from the cancer of interest, but because cancer treatments can have serious side effects, then the reality is we need all-cause mortality as an endpoint, because if you stop somebody from dying from a cancer but increase their risk of dying from something else, well, the screening itself might not be useful. I haven't got time to go into clinical trial design, and demonstrating all-cause mortality reduction is phenomenally difficult, which is probably the reason why it is rarely used. And so ultimately, the only way to evaluate a screening test is through a randomized controlled trial, where you randomize individuals either to have or not to have the test. And where we're talking about multimodal tests with lots of cancers, really all-cause mortality is the only sensible endpoint. You could use cancer-specific mortality for a whole set of different cancers, but determining of the cause of mortality is susceptible to observer bias. But the long and the short of it is that randomized trials are difficult. You need very large studies, they're expensive, and they take a lot of or a long time to get all the data and all the follow-up. So what do we know about the Grail test? Well, the claim is that it can detect 50 different types of cancer. But why do I think it's unlikely to be useful for screening? So it hasn't been evaluated in a trial. The major paper published on it, they used it to evaluate 654 samples from individuals with symptomatic cancer. So these are not even asymptomatic cases. And of those, only 185 were stage 1 and 166 stage 2. And they also applied it to 610 individuals without cancer, although we don't know what conditions, if any, they did have. So how good is it at detecting early stage cancer? So across all the different cancers, if we have 100 individuals with stage 1 cancer, the Grail test detected 19 of them. I got to say that is a really poor performance in terms of sensitivity for the sorts of cancer we want to detect. And bearing in mind, these are symptomatic stage 1 cancers. So in asymptomatic stage 1 cancers, it'll be worse. And so what we don't know is how good it is for specific cancer types, because that was across all the different cancers in that set of 185. So I can't say it's not going to be really good for some very specific cancers. The data are not there. So how good is it at distinguishing cancer from other diseases? So most individuals without cancer test negative with the Grail test. It has a specificity of 99.3%. Although that does mean that 7 in every 1,000 individuals having this test who don't have cancer will have lots of investigations to try and identify the cancer that isn't there. And as I said, we don't actually know what illnesses these individuals did have. So other major issues, even if the test is abnormal, the cancer still has to be found. And if you're really detecting cancers very early, then finding the cancer with other methods like X-rays or CT scans or MRI scans or anything else may prove very difficult. And so clearly, if you have a positive test and nothing can be found, that is a worrying thing for the individual without necessarily being any benefit. And so protocols for what you do with positive tests where cancer can't be found need to be worked out and well established. And so ultimately, I think there's major problems with the Grail test. it's actually not very good at detecting early cancer. It's only been evaluated on small numbers. We don't really know what the pathways of care should be when an abnormal test is found. You know, if they say this is most likely to be a pancreatic cancer and you can't find a pancreatic cancer, how much effort needs to be put into finding a cancer somewhere else in the body? We really don't know. We have no idea whether it reduces the incidence of late-stage disease. The trial that was announced 2 years ago should at least tell us something about that, but it won't tell us anything about cancer-specific mortality, because I don't think it's powered to do so. And it certainly won't tell us about all-cause mortality. So what's needed? Well, I would say before doing the NHS-based trial, it should have been evaluated in a reasonably large number of individuals with symptoms who have stage 1 cancer. And it would be relatively straightforward. It would have been relatively straightforward to pick 100 individuals newly diagnosed with stage 1 cancers at different sites and evaluate the sensitivity of the Grail test. And I would argue that if you can't detect at least 50% of them, it's unlikely to be a useful screening test. And then if it is shown to be potentially useful, then randomized trials with mortality endpoints are absolutely necessary. So there was lots of criticism when the Grail trial was announced from various people. And Harpal Kumar, who formerly at Cancer Research UK, but then president of Grail Europe, responded in the BMJ with what I think is a slightly disingenuous reply. First of all, he starts off by claiming that it's a private company, but intended to have their test for public health uptake, as if somehow their primary interest is not making money. You know, most tests are for public health uptake. I mean, what does that mean? It's just people in the public having the test. And, you know, he claims that the trial will shorten the timeline so that innovations are made available to patients faster than would otherwise be possible. But I would say that the trial that they're doing is not an adequate trial, and so it's questionable whether that is true. And I just wanted to say something about the TrueCheck test that Laura Donnelly was promoting in the Telegraph. So there's one paper published on this study based on a study done in India. They claim a sensitivity of 92% of 6,200 symptomatic individuals. Again, we don't know about asymptomatic individuals with cancer diagnoses. And they also tested another 9,400 cases undergoing treatment. However, in this paper, they don't tell us anything at all about the stage of these individuals at diagnosis. But across the 15,000 cases in total, 2/3 of them had metastases at diagnosis. So it's very unlikely that they're detecting early stage disease here. And then if a test can't detect metastatic disease, then it really is a useless test. So we don't know anything about its sensitivity in early stage disease. As far as specificity goes, it was tested on, again, a very large number, but the specificity was only 95%. That would mean that 5% of all patients, which is most of the individuals being tested, who do not have cancer will require extensive investigation. Seems very unlikely that this is a useful test to me. But again, it hasn't been evaluated in trials. So I think it's worth remembering that the benefits of early detection, assuming you can do early detection, are not self-evident. You need to be able to detect early stage cancers with a high sensitivity, and even then randomized controlled trials are required. There have been many hyped blood tests over the past 40 years as cancer screening tests, and the reality is none of them have ever proven reasonably useful in stringent studies. And that's because proving an early detection test is really useful screening is incredibly difficult. So I will finish there and say, go back to the beginning, multimodal cancer screening tests. Yes, lots and lots of hype, but the hope, I think, is at the moment, faint hope. Of course, it would be great if they do work really well, but I am a little bit doubtful that will pan out to be true. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. So if you could close the slides and people can turn their cameras on so we can see everyone. Please go ahead, raise your hands if you have a question for Paul. Susan, yes, go ahead, please, and then Richard. Susan, would you like to go first? Oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead, please.
Fantastic. Paul, hello, long time. Absolutely masterful. Really enjoyed it. It's marvelous to hear some common sense coming through. I guess the direct question I'd like to ask you, first of all, apart from how are you, is you've obviously seen the protocol and scrutinized it now and looked at the endpoints they're looking at, which obviously is, you know, a decrease of, my understanding, a decrease in the incidence of stage 3-4 cancers for the bigger trial. And then there's this sub trial going on with Simplify. I guess my question is, what do you think, first, is it a well-designed, do you think it's properly designed in any shape or form to answer the questions you've been alluding to? And secondly, what's your view on this second subgroup analysis, the Simplify trial that they're doing?
So I think, as I said, you know, a sort of without which not of an effective screening test is that it should reduce the incidence of late stage disease. And I have no doubt that this trial, if the Galleri test does that, will demonstrate, or has the power to demonstrate, a reasonable reduction in the incidence of late stage disease, because that's what it's designed to do.
Right.
But ultimately, that's still only a proxy for the ultimate endpoint, which is mortality.
Right.
And without having that in the trial, you still don't know, and the potential harms are such that, you know, you need to know what the mortality reduction is. And when it's multimodal, you know, there's all sorts of things going on here around, you know, additional investigations, how individuals with what may well be overdiagnosed cancers are treated. So I think it's going to be very difficult. I think that, you know, if there is a reduction in late stage disease, it's going to be kind of pushed extremely hard by those with the vested interests. But I think that would be a mistake to do that. I don't know enough about the sort of whatever you want to call it, the sub trial to comment on it, I'm afraid.
Okay, no, that's really useful. No, I agree with you. I think this has been a massive piece of insider dealing going on to drive this trial through. And you know, the general sense is it came up as well at, you know, if you go and look at Hansard, it came up before the Parliamentary Select Committee, and the focus was entirely on dealing with the massive problem we have in late stage diagnosis and delays in diagnostic pathways and treatment pathways. It was all tech focused, you know, AI syndromic in GPs all the way through to blood tests. And so this is a narrative that's being created around this. I think it's extremely dangerous because people don't want to focus on the hard work that's actually needed to get early diagnosis.
I agree with that completely. I mean, I didn't cover it at all in what I just taught, but you know, for every screening test, there's an opportunity cost. And I started off by talking about prevention.
Right.
And maybe if I'd said at the end, but actually, you know, we are pretty good at treating a lot of cancers these days, and putting the same amount of resource into improving the way we treat cancer may well give you many more bangs for your buck. And so one of the issues around this kind of stage shift is that, you know, a stage 2 cancer, shifting it from stage 3 to stage 2 and achieving true stage shift, the reduction into stage 3, still not might make any difference to mortality,
Right.
If the stage 2 cancer has early metastasis, you may then have a cancer. So my example would be in breast cancer, for example, where you shift a cancer from being node positive to node negative. It is node positive when diagnosed, but it is node negative because you can't detect the metastasis. You now don't give that woman adjuvant chemotherapy. And by detecting that cancer early, you've harmed her because you're not giving her the treatment she actually needs. You've not turned it from a non-curable into a curable disease. You've turned it from a curable with surgery and chemotherapy into a not curable by surgery alone. So there's all sorts of, I'm not saying that happens necessarily, but the only way you can determine whether that has happened is with a randomized trial, with mortality as the endpoint.
Right. And just to follow up, this is more for Andrew and Elizabeth, is also, I don't know how you're going to do the health economics around this if it's just stage shift. I just don't know how you're going to demonstrate this is cost effective for the NHS and overall it's affordable. But anyway, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, Paul.
I know what will happen. There will be a bit of stage shift. I mean, it's kind of inevitable. There must be.
Right. Right.
If whatever you detect, you'll detect it a little bit early, and you get a bit of stage shift. You then do all sorts of complex modelling that says, "Oh, look, we've done this modelling, and if we make these assumptions, this is the benefit."
Mm.
I'm going to tell you, it's preordained, the result of this trial.
I agree. I'm afraid. Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul. Marvelous, really.
Thanks, Richard. You actually led it to the question that I had in my head, and then maybe Andrew can pick it up from there. So, Paul, since you're now getting acquainted with the American healthcare system, this looks like a very attractive consumer product for American people who may go privately and just pay for the test. And where's insurance would fall with this? Because of course, this is not a centralized reimbursement decision. And do you see this taking up more, I wouldn't say as a consumer product, it's not a healthcare system intervention as a national screening program, but as a maybe local, maybe personal choice tool. So do you see this having a potential in the US? Considering it performs in the clinical trial in the way that it's a maybe, let's say.
Well, first of all, we know that the way that these tests are marketed, when they are marketed in any sort of non-socialized healthcare system, is, so far from properly informed consent. As I showed you, the web page of the Cancer Screening Trust and their marketing of the TrueCheck test in the UK. I mean, they're not interested in telling the truth and giving people informed information so they can make an informed decision. So they want people to buy their test, which maybe. And I know that, for example, the Grail test, one of for them, the major advantage of getting this partnership with the NHS is that they'd be able to sort of advertise it in the US and saying, look, it's being used by the NHS. And in the NHS, they only ever do things that are really good value for money and work because it's, I mean, basically in the NHS, they let you die. So it has to be really good before you're treated. And so they've been very happy to kind of, have the NHS as a sort of badge of honor to their marketing. I mean, I don't know whether that's made any difference to the uptake or not, but it's clear that that's what they hope. And of course, a test that you need to have every couple of years, that is just a blood test that you can charge money for, that's the whole population, is a real money spinner. I mean, if you do, whatever, fifth of the US population, 50 million people a year having a test that costs $100 or $100 markup, they're making a huge sum of money for not very much. And as I said at the beginning, in the NHS, when these things are offered privately, it's the NHS that picks up the pieces of all the overdiagnosis and the overtreatment. And even the investigation. If you go to TrueCheck and you have a test and you're a positive test, you end up with your GP who's then forced to do something about it. It's completely unreasonable.
Okay, we have one comment in the chat, and then we have a question from Joanna. So let me first read the chat comment, a question, and then we get to Joanna. So there's a comment from Sophie, and it says, for some cancers, especially blood cancer, some treatments can slow down the progression, and treatments can improve quality of life for some symptoms that would be left unresolved without an early diagnosis. Some blood cancers also take years to diagnose as either asymptomatic or symptoms not cancer specific. So Paul, can you see benefits for these early tests in situations as described above?
Well, the first thing to say is that, in asymptomatic disease, you have to demonstrate that there's those benefits. To say that treatments can improve quality of life for some symptoms that will be unresolved without early diagnosis. Well, you're talking there about the diagnosis of symptomatic disease, and that is not screening. That is diagnosis of symptomatic disease. And yes, I do think these tests could have a place in diagnosis, because if you've got symptoms, then getting a rapid diagnosis is important. And if it's sensitive in symptomatic disease, often symptomatics are non-specific. And so you can decide fairly quickly whether those symptoms are likely to be cancer and need further investigation or not. So I do think they may have a role in symptomatic disease, although whether they really improve pathways to care in people with symptoms, I don't know. And we know that some cancers take many years to diagnose. That is absolutely true. But the problem is that we don't know that diagnosing them many years earlier improves outcomes. That's the whole point about the lead time bias. I mean, I'm a 60-year-old male. If you looked hard enough in me, you will find some cancer cells. I may well have some cancer cells in my prostate. I may well have some cancer cells in my bone marrow. The likelihood is that I will die from something else without those cancer cells ever becoming a problem. And so if you diagnose them in me, I've now got a problem because I've got a diagnosed cancer. That it's very hard not to treat cancer once you've diagnosed it. And I think, if you waved your magic wand over me and said, oh, you've got a prostate cancer, I would find that, I mean, this is a personal view, I would find it very hard not to want it treated now. So not knowing for me is definitely better. I would not like, and people say, oh, well, you can do watchful waiting. I think the idea that I've got cancer and I'm going to go back every 6 months to find out whether it's progressed or not is really not going to improve my quality of life at all. So these tests may have benefits. I can see the potential benefits, but they have to be proven. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you, Paul. So Joanna, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for the very sensible talk. I just had a question about sensitivity in general, and when sensitivity is good enough. And although the sensitivity of this test does seem pretty bad so far, their specificity is pretty high compared to other screening programs. And obviously then if they lower their specificity, they could increase their sensitivity. So how do you say this test was extremely cheap and easy to do, and you could make it not very sensitive, but theoretically like 99.999% specific? Like, how do you determine when it is good enough to do? Is it a cost decision to the healthcare system and a cost benefit decision? Say it was much cheaper to implement, and I don't know the costs of running it, than another screening program. Like, how do you make that choice?
I mean, I'm going to say in the grand scheme of things, if these tests were just broadly speaking effective, in theory, they're going to be relatively cheap. you don't need all the infrastructure. A mammogram program is expensive because of all the infrastructure you need with mammography to do the mammograms, to read the mammograms, and so on and so forth. A colonoscopy screening program is expensive because of having all the infrastructure to do colonoscopy is expensive. The infrastructure to take a blood test is actually, is almost minimal. You're talking about, in reality, these tests, you get the cost down to pounds each time. And so to screen everybody every couple of years would not be that expensive. So I don't think cost effectiveness is ever really going to be the key selling point or this key problem. It's going to remain the real benefits and harms of doing the test. And I think I'll just go back to your first point. I don't think with these tests, actually, it's not like so many tests where you can kind of dial down the specificity and increase the sensitivity. For these kind of tests, a specificity of less than 99 point something % is really not good enough, because you're going to investigate all of those people. And, if you do 1 million tests and 1% of them are false positives, that's an awful lot of people being investigated for no reason. But don't forget, if you diagnose something and there's nothing there, you're going to have to do all sorts of invasive things like endoscopies, CT scans, MRI scans. Who knows what you're going to do? How hard are you going to look? So ultimately, I'll just keep saying it, you have to do the RCT, and that's why it's so difficult, because actually, when do you decide when it's good enough to do the randomized controlled trial? When do you decide, all right, I'm going to invest in this and do a randomized trial? My view is, because it's so difficult, we should actually spend our time researching and doing other things, because screening is just, I'm not saying there never would be a great screening test, but at the moment, we're so far from being there that we should put the money into other things.
Yeah. And I think, as Francois was saying, it's not enough to just do sensitivity and specificity. I think that's another point. Like, would you still, even though this is a multi-cancer early detection test, have to evaluate it for every single cancer and in terms of the prevalence of each cancer, etc., etc.?
Well, I'm going to say not. In reality, if it's a multi-cancer test, then you're going to have to say, well, if it's really detecting lots of cancers, it should be reducing all-cause mortality, and therefore all-cause mortality should be your endpoint. And you could say, well, it's possible that it's actually increasing your chance of mortality from some specific cancer. It's very unlikely that a test will increase your risk of dying from cancer. You could argue things like, well, doing a biopsy of an indolent cancer may turn it into an aggressive cancer, but I don't think that's a real problem. The real problem is the mortality from other causes associated with treatment, like radiotherapy or even potentially chemotherapy, although you might argue that, if a cancer needs chemotherapy, it's not an overdiagnosed cancer. But, those other things I think are important. And if you're detecting 50 cancers and you can't detect all-cause mortality, it's a pretty small effect.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we have Susan and Jordan. Susan, go ahead.
Well, my first question probably is for Andrew, actually, which is two things. One, I agree with everyone about the insider dealing and the corruption at the top, and I'm just appalled that many of the fraudulent things that go on in the health sector are not crimes where they would be in if it was, other kinds. So I think we have two things. How can we get rid of this so it doesn't collapse the NHS? And I share this idea because people here may be in touch with parliamentary lawmakers. It seems to me that it is wicked that people can charge, they have a puff piece from a journalist in the Telegraph for £2,500 given to her and her new husband, and land it on the NHS. And it seems to me that the Consumer and Markets Authority should be saying, anytime you have a test, whether it's a Fitbit or an ECG or a cancer blood test, the cost of that test should have the insurance in it that all the on costs are in the private sector. This will boost the private sector, which will be a good thing as far as the Tories are concerned, but it would protect the NHS for those of us who are actually sick. So it seems to me that there must be some way to contain the costs so that they don't land increasingly on the NHS. And the second thing is, how on earth can we get the National Screening Committee, which is just ignored and sidelined and has been sitting on breast cancer for all these years, into something like NICE, which is why you don't have to answer my question, just move on to Andrew.
Andrew, now you have a lot of points and questions to handle. Go ahead, please. We cannot hear you.
Can't hear you, Andrew.
There's something wrong with the microphone. So maybe while Andrew reconnects, can you try to reconnect, and we'll see if we can hear you. While Andrew is reconnecting, just one point to make, and he may cover it as well. So this is a huge cost effectiveness issue, because even if this test is free, we have to cost all the consequences that you, Paul, so clearly described, because from cost effectiveness perspective, we have to look at final outcomes and clinically relevant outcomes. So every unnecessary, in quotes, or potentially necessary test would have to be costed. So it's a much bigger question. Andrew, do you want to try to have a go?
Now you're on mute, Lisa.
Okay, what about now? Okay. So Andrew, I'll have to do your cost effectiveness part now because we cannot hear you. So yeah, it's a big issue. So I think from the NHS evaluation, it's not going to go to NICE. It should go to the screening committee, as Susan has said. And I don't know how to handle Susan's question, why they haven't merged. Andrew would have the insights. You can actually type your comment into the chat. So, but yeah, I cannot see how with current results, the technology might end up in a public health service. But I also am very curious to wait and see how this technology will end up in commercial service, like in the US. And I think it can be actually a very popular tool here. So, John, final question, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, sorry, and my camera is not working. So it was a fantastic talk. I was thinking about the statins that are being prescribed everywhere in the States, and a study that I saw that it's had absolutely no impact on obesity. So because people think they can take statins and that will stop them having a heart attack, their lifestyle has not changed at all. So I just wondered if you thought, another negative thing about offering these sorts of tests, that will then reduce the impact on trying to change lifestyle, which might have an impact on the incidence of cancers.
Is that a question for me? I mean, I'd sort of put a more general public health hat on here. I mean, I have to say public health attempts to modify kind of lifestyles at a population level have been, apart from smoking, spectacularly unsuccessful. And I mean, particularly alcohol and diet, and that's because I think, largely speaking, we're competing against structural issues. I mean, they're very complex around the way these things are marketed, and I'm not sure that things like the availability of statins really makes any real difference to whether people would achieve weight loss and so on. I mean, do people who are taking statins sort of think, oh, well, it's fine, I can eat what I like? I suspect not. In fact, I suspect the people who are willing to take the statins are actually the ones who are more motivated to actually try to change their lifestyles. I mean, somebody's put in a comment that that seatbelts and motorcycle helmets are spectacularly successful. I agree with that. The things that you can legislate people have to do are very effective in terms of, I mean, you know, health and safety at work is spectacularly successful in that sense. I meant things that just try and get people to do the right thing themselves. I mean, you know, and you could say stopping drink driving has been quite successful as a public health measure, although again, it's illegal.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. I will read your comment because it will be recorded this way into the our video that we'll post. So your response is that I know that the NHS has already decided that it intends to diagnose 75% of all cancers in their early stages, NHS long-term plan, because they will be easier to treat. This is from Amanda Pritchard, NHS CEO. Seems to me that we need to tackle this at the policy level. Otherwise, we will spend huge amounts of time and money developing and evaluating diagnostics of dubious value. So thank you so much for this comment. And David, last point of question from you, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. I wonder whether the oft-cited thing that half or 3/4 of cancers are avoidable by changing your diet is really true. I mean, there's nothing quite as messy as nutritional research. And it seems to me probably unlikely that spending large amounts of money on that is going to be productive. What do you think?
Again, if there's a question directed to me, I mean, it's a little bit off topic. I mean, I think there's a lot of cancers caused by obesity, which of course is caused by diet, and whether it's really as much as that, I don't know. Certainly some specific cancers, you know, diet would make a huge difference, but it may not be that big. I think, you know, obesity has other problems besides cancer. I mean, but a lot of it is structural in society, and it's very hard for individuals. I mean, I think the focus on individuals is misplaced in a lot of public health issues, and I certainly think that the Conservative government sort of throws things, you know, and blames things on individuals rather than on kind of society and structural things. But that's a little bit different from multimodal screening tests.
Yes, sorry.
It's all right.
Paul, thank you so much. Fantastic talk, very good learning for all of us. And we are waiting for the next Netflix series on the subject. So the story to be continued, the trial is continuing. So let's see how it goes, and let's see whether science and whether decisions and emotions take us on the subject. Thank you very much.